When last we were here, we were talking, I backspaced a couple of slides from where we were before, and I wanted to talk about the general idea that, for example, if we're taking a look at the data set example that was in the last homework assignment, we think about our data as having rows and columns. And in this particular example, this is kind of a stereotyped example that we look at a lot in statistics about flowers that were measured. And maybe you want to see if there's different kinds of species, or maybe if some species are related to others. So you have the sepal length and width and the length of the petals, and you're trying to, and the width of the petals, and you're trying to figure out, do these flowers kind of go into groups? But the take-home message here is that the rows of this data set constitute individuals, and the columns constitute individual variables in the data set. Well, in the same fashion, when we're playing around with, let me come back to the PowerPoint, data, that's only one way of cutting the data. That the homework assignment looked at variables across individual observations. And you could just as easily take a look at cutting the same data set, looking at maybe only one person across a bunch of variables over many measurement occasions. And as things change, I mean, really for psychology, you folks are in a very exciting time, because there's all of this massive time-related data. There's these little gadgets that measure how many steps we take and what our heart rate is and what our breathing rate is. There's things like social media that people engage with repeatedly over the course of time. And maybe you'd be able to understand why some people do the things they do over the course of time by looking at just that type of data. And the example I was talking about, let me pause for a bit. What's extra credit? Chapter 14 is extra credit. So the inquisitive. Right? Or was it? So if you're looking at individual observations, especially if you're dealing with a medication or a treatment condition, the case of insulin and diabetes being one example of something that fluctuates fairly rapidly over the course of time, and you want to intervene with just the right amount of the medication so that the person doesn't go into insulin shock, or suffer any of the other adverse effects of the disease, and how the medication spreads into the bloodstream and how the body starts to process sugar may vary from one person to another, depending on some of the individual conditions, like how fast the heart rate is going, or whether you're hot or cold at the moment. And as I was talking about before, there are some reasons to think that even though we all have normal fluctuation in our bodies or our moods or our attitudes, for some populations of people, those fluctuations are much more slow over the course of time. And you young people, it's really pretty rapid. And your bodies are very resilient and adapt to things very quickly. So we talked a little bit about this particular slide and how small n designs are different from large n designs. And we covered that the last time. Basically, you are focusing more on the dynamics of an individual over the course of time rather than one snapshot of all kinds of people. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that when you're looking at just a large sample study of everybody, gosh, some of those people have been changing over the course of time. So maybe the reasons that correlations that you observe between two variables are not exactly correct is some of these people have slow changing reactions to stimuli. Some people have rapid ones. Just one big snapshot taken once is really kind of hard to tell what's going on. So the book talks about a few things that are examples of small n designs, and I can also think of other ones that I've done over the course of time. Some of the small subject research things are based on an extraordinary situation that has happened that constitutes a natural effect. So in this case, Henry suffered from epileptic seizures, and the surgeon proposed a radical surgery that took out a lot of the hippocampus on both the right and the left side of the brain. And one of the things that made this an interesting issue is that, I'm trying to get my slide here so I can move this up, is that he no longer had the memory for the doctors and nurses who took care of him. And he kind of covered for it. I mean, you can Google him on YouTube and see some of the interviews that happened. But the memory was destroyed. Well, in this particular case, given that at that time people were wondering what the role of various organs in the brain were, this surgery constituted an opportunity to investigate maybe what function was particularly associated with that region of the brain. All right. And there's always some issues involved in any small n research. It's suggestive. We don't necessarily say, gosh, this is going to definitively advance psychology, because we don't know if there's something particular about what happened to this person. So in the case of Henry, he had seizures, and they were of such intensity that these seizures could also affect other parts of functioning. We don't really have a pre and post study of Henry. I mean, we have some impressions, but not a formal assessment about how his memory was working before surgery or after surgery. We also don't know if something else got disturbed in the course of the operation that was really what caused this to happen. So, for example, regrettably, gang, I've kind of been there. My wife has had 2 brain surgeries herself, and when they go in to do a brain surgery, the brain expands quite a bit, and that makes it hard to locate the geography of what you're looking at, but also that expansion is itself a form of brain trauma. And when you're recovering from brain surgery, they also give you a lot of medications, basically to handle the swelling that happens, but it also has kind of slightly undesirable effect that it starts to trim some of your brain synapses. So do you really know, if you're looking at this, was this actually a clean-cut situation that we know that this was exactly due to this surgery in this particular part of the brain? You don't get control of the manipulation. It just happens. Replication is often a problem, particularly if this is a really, really small sample. I know Steve Hackley in our department was doing research with Korsakoff's patients, and there's just very, very few people with Korsakoff's, and some of it is idiopathic, which is a fancy word for saying the thing that caused the problem is perhaps different from person to person. So even though the diagnosis is the same, gee, we don't really know if we replicated this. And when you're studying people within a small group study, that's kind of it's kind of an issue. To what extent can we generalize from that? And there are some issues sometimes with ethics that you can't exactly go in and do a control group with somebody who doesn't suffer from epilepsy and see if removing that part of the brain would affect things. There's also some issues involved in surgery of ethics of what's going to go on with that person, and you have to be especially careful, especially in the case of people like Henry, where they are at reduced capacity after the surgery, and even though he was agreeable to participate, you need to be careful about whether you have consented or whether you have someone adequately consented. The medical school, I've done a couple of human subjects things here with disadvantaged populations. If it's an intensive investigation, you can get to the point where you hire an ad litem for that particular participant, and a guardian ad litem is someone who is legally nominated by a court to talk about, what is the person's actual best interest when that person is not in a position to determine their own best interest. Now, in the case of Henry, we only had a post-test thing to use some of our language, but other times you can look at some type of baseline and then an intervention. So in this particular case, we're going to have people do a baseline of the words that they recall, and then have them do some expanded rehearsal and see if they can recall things better over the course of time. And this is nice because it gives you some sort of a pre and a post-test sense of what's going on. It's not exactly drawing a line in this particular case and grouping all the scores to the left of 5 with all the scores to the right of 5, mainly because usually if you're doing a medication, if you're doing a therapy, people tend to get better over the course of time. So very often this baseline assessment is used to establish a base rate, and then we analyze what's to the right of that a little bit more. And the other nice thing about this, especially if you're looking at psychotherapy, is you can vary the length of the baseline. You can also vary the length of the intervention that you're looking at. And that helps you understand whether the changes that you are seeing are going to asymptote, sort of flatten out over the course of time, or they're going to keep on going. And also extending the baseline lets you know a little bit more what's the variability in performance that happens. This little curve that you're seeing here is kind of typical of what you often see, that at the very beginning, the first few assessments look a little bit different. In this case, maybe the person's really excited to be in the experiment and they're going to try to really comply, and they try really hard to recall words, and after that they get tired of working so hard and that goes back down. If you're looking at things like depression or anxiety, very often those first few assessments are somewhat atypical, and you might end up saying, well, really, I'm going to discount those first few things and then do the warm-up period later. What's another example of that? Sometimes people are looking at reaction time tasks, and they'll throw out the first few reaction times just because you got to get used to the apparatus. And at other times, we can do a multiple baseline design. So in this case, let's just try to make this a little bigger so you can see it. The example here is looking at people's anxiety in response to being around a dog and the effects of some therapy. So what we have going on here is a baseline for the first person that's relatively short, a longer baseline, and an even longer baseline. And then we do our systematic desensitization and reinforcement of the child to reduce that. And then after that, we expose the child, in this case, 3 children, John, Sally, and Bob, to what's going to happen with another dog, which does this actually generalize. And our goal here is to see whether everybody's going to be going back down to a baseline. And this data set is kind of nice because it's a figure that shows often what happens. You're putting the child in a room with a dog, and they're stated to be very fearful of the dog. Sometimes, you have kind of a spontaneous low report and they go back up again. Other times, if this baseline is too short, the anxiety is still there. Notice there's some substantial inter-individual differences in stated fear here. This person, Sally, gets a lot closer to the dog at the beginning. John is having none of it. So, you can describe in a qualitative fashion what's going on with multiple baselines and assess generalizability. Okay, come here. And this is kind of my favorite. That you're looking at a treatment and then you can withdraw that treatment. So in this case, you've got a The problem behavior that you're looking at is rumination. That's basically, rumination's just like a cow chewing its rumen. They can go over and over and over again thinking about something. And what we have is baseline here. We employ a treatment. This reduces rumination. And then we withdraw that treatment. And it goes back up. And we try treatment again. And we withdraw it again, and so forth. And in that fashion, this is going to establish the efficacy of the treatment and the necessity for whether you need to continue the treatment and or kind of make this treatment a lifestyle situation versus a cure. If, for example, you did the baseline, you did the treatment, and then all subsequent baselines were low, you would have a stronger case for saying, this is an efficacious treatment, and it's kind of like it's functioning more like a cure than an adjunct to life. And that happens in medications, it happens in psychotherapy, it happens in trying to have people have new behaviors. And do they actually need some prompts to continue on with that? Another thing that happens if you're looking at baseline and treatment things over longer term is some medications wear out in terms of their efficacy. So depression medications, for example, they may end up working just fine for a number of years, and then all of a sudden they will stop working. And if you're looking at baseline and treatment studies, over the course of time, you can assess whether this medication is just not working for you. Unfortunately, in the case of depression, we have lots and lots of pharmaceutical alternatives. And if one is not working or if the side effects are becoming unworkable for you, you can change. So here's something of my own invention. And it's kind of in my response to the observation that this chapter feels a bit stuck on in this book, and the cautions about generalizability to large populations kind of gives you the impression that, where the really big psychology is being done is with large numbers of people, because you'll have small confidence intervals on your estimates of means. And this was a small exercise that I did way back when I was a graduate student at Minnesota. And Jim Rest came into the room, kind of a nice guy. He said, "Hey, name some of the biggest features in the biggest names in psychology." And what I've done here, rather than kind of extract things from everybody, is to go to the APA website and get the top 10 psychologists as the most cited psychologists. And the top 3, B.F. Skinner, Jean Piaget, and Sigmund Freud, are the same as they used to be back in my day. And number 6, Carl Rogers, used to be the number 4, and Maslow used to be the number 5. And I underlined those because these are the most famous names in psychology, and what do they all have in common? Well, given the topic of our class, n equals 1. All of these people made their names based on the study of one individual at a time. In the case of B.F. Skinner, it was people and pigeons and rats, but always studied one at a time. B.F. Skinner was pretty happy to say, if you need statistics to justify your experiment, do a better experiment. And as the book talks about, Jean Piaget developed his theories of child development by observing his own children. And it was kind of funny because if you go back and you read some of what he talks about, when children are very small, you have the opportunity to really see literally what's going on in their heads. And as they get older, they get more secretive. They would pick up their toys and walk away from him so he could not be watching them while they were playing. File this away in your future life as a parent, because in my household, I'm the one who cooks the meals. And when my daughter Julie was 2 years old, it was very nice because her brain was directly connected to her mouth. And if I heard this little voice from the other room saying, "Julie, what are you doing? You are going to fall and break your neck," I knew that it was time to put down what it was doing and rush into the next room, because the child was, I don't know, climbing and walking around on the back of the couch. This was also the child who had the brave insight that you can pull each of the drawers out in your kitchen just a little bit. This then makes a little staircase and you can get up and walk around on the countertop. It's like, but the inner life was constantly exposed. Sigmund Freud, in his studies of psychopathology, if you go back and read what he wrote, it's all about individual case studies, like the Wolf Man, Little Hans, those types of things. And Carl Rogers is, I don't know if you probably don't hear much about that name, but he's the originator of client-centered therapy. So when you hear people making fun of psychologists, therapists by saying, well, what does that mean for you? Or, when a client says something and the therapist will say, so you're saying you're feeling really angry now. The idea of client-centered therapy was to reflect the emotions, and in the process of reflecting them and getting them to elaborate them, that they will then make therapeutic progress. Now, to some extent, having people talk and getting people to a space where they do talk is productive, and it's often kind of a cheap shot to talk about how California and laid-back client-centered therapy is. But it's somewhat remarkable to observe that Carl Rogers developed his theory of client-centered therapy by working with psychotic schizophrenics. There's people who are absolutely unhinged from reality, and this seemed to work well for him. And down at the bottom, we have Maslow with his hierarchy of needs, also based on an introspection on an N of 1 design. So, that's just something I wanted to say, that to me, some of the most exciting new data in psychology is individual data gathered over the course of time, and maybe how now we're kind of in this in-between time where you can have lots and lots of data across lots and lots of measurement occasions, like Twitter feeds or social media feeds, or lots of data from Palm Pilots or Fitbit or fitness machines. But we do not yet know quite how best to combine these things, and the statistical models vary as a function of that. And it's been my experience that even in people looking at developmental psychology, we don't often talk a lot about Jean Piaget and how the theories happen. Just as I said at the very beginning of the class, the theory did not come from Jean Piaget. The theory came from Piaget observing, making some observations, and those observations did have some embedded theory in them. However, the theory also was part of that inductive hypothetico-deductive spiral, that he observed that maybe children pay attention to only one dimension of a stimulus and not to the other. So critical tests of that were to present children with, in this case, two glasses. In this case, the girl is looking at two small squat glasses. The water is poured into the two small glasses first, and you ask the child, does one of these glasses have more liquid in it than the other? And they'd say, no, it's the same. And then you take the liquid and you pour it into a narrower, taller glass, and the child will now say, well, this glass now has more water in it. And that confirmed some of Piaget's theories about the systematic cognitive errors that children make. The reason I talk about Piaget a bit is people have in developmental psychology fallen out of love with Piaget a bit. Some of the work that I have done with college students has been to promote developmental theories about how you change from age 18 to around age 30, because you keep learning, you keep changing in terms of your ability to reason about the world. Just kind of as I said earlier on, that people say, oh, I'm just world's different after my freshman year. Those are valid observations. Here, don't know why it's not advancing. Ebbinghaus was really kind of the first person to do a small n design where he had little nonsense words with 2 consonants and a vowel, and he tried to memorize them and looked at how things fell away over the course of time. And this curve that results was news to people that memory decays according to a given shape. And this led to an entire branch of psychology dedicated to the idea of maybe figuring out what the mathematical form of this curve is. So in this case, this looks like a declining curve, and they actually did, subsequent people wanted to do an awful lot of mathematical work to describe exactly how that happens. In my own work, I kind of reverse that. Psychology can look at anything over the course of time, and growth is something that I look at. Biological systems grow differently according to how you do measurements over the course of time. And there are lots of curves that kind of start out flat and then do a lot of growth and then level off. They have fancy names like the logistic or the Gompertz or the von Bertalanffy curves. And in the case of studying repeated measures data, you can then fit and compare and contrast the relative merits of these mathematical models to looking at things like growth and change. And those are probably, for my thinking, some of the more valuable areas that we can get into in psychology for studying growth and change. The problem is it gets a little mathy. And I'll let you in a little secret, maybe some of you do this, is that in psychology, a lot of people these days go into psychology because they're not that interested in math. So it's kind of an issue of establishing the value of having some rigor in doing your model, because that lets you do more interesting things. So just because it's a small n design, we can walk through this small n design and think about the 4 validities. And if you're thinking about internal validity, it would seem that a small n design can have very high internal validity, because if you have really precise measurement that goes on, and you can operationalize what you have, and talk pretty plainly about the phenomenon that's under investigation. It's a little bit harder, for example, if you're doing large surveys out there, as to really interpret what the stimulus is meaning to the various people going on. External validity, as she mentioned in several other things, that's kind of an issue, because we don't know, when we're doing a small sample, how does this generalize to lots of other people. Now, this can be really difficult, as in the case of brain surgery, or it can be merely problematical if you're looking at, say, different children in a small number, because at the end of the day, in this fear of dog study, you've only got 3 people. So you have not really a very good estimate at all of what the variation is across many, many people. Construct validity, well, very often we can kind of control that. And we can really talk about exactly what we're looking at. In times of small n designs where you have a person who's cooperative, you can gather data on several constructs. Other times, this is kind of pretty difficult. So in the case of the brain surgery example, do you have a good set of assessments on all of the other constructs that could be going on that could explain this sudden decrement? Do we think that the hippocampus is only involved in short-term memory, or are there a variety of other things? Statistical validity, again, it's a little bit complicated because at the end of the day, you have a mean for one person, and you don't really have a good sense of what the variation is across people. And when you have a small number of people, your guesses about how variability changes across people is still pretty all over the board, so to speak. Very often in small n designs where we're looking at therapy outcomes, there's not a lot of statistical analysis that goes on. They show you the picture, and the picture is thought to be obvious enough. So that finishes my comments about small n designs. Are there any questions? We have a few minutes. I was reading the following article about the Johnson & Johnson pause. Oh, please stop that. I don't want to sign up for your daily briefing. And it occurred to me that this is really kind of a nice example of some of the central ideas that the course is trying to make about how you interpret the science and how you interpret the journalistic interpretation of this. So Axios Ipsos recently had a nice poll where they asked people about, do you think that the Johnson & Johnson pause was the right call? And does this make you more or less likely to get vaccinated? Now, the first thing that they did was to ask about, are you aware of these things? And a lot of people said they were aware. And the second thing they talked about was, do you think that the FDA and CDC were responsible by recommending this pause? And 88% of the people did. And the news articles that I was reading said, therefore we know that this is a good idea and that this will help convince people to become more vaccinated. So what's wrong with that? You can chat or you can talk. What I'm looking for is drawing on some of the ideas from the class in terms of how you critically evaluate a journalistic claim. In light of the 4 validities, what types of things might be at work here? Yeah. Is it a representative sample that generalizes to Americans? That's a good one. And say even we said say it was a representative sample of all Americans. Would that work? Is that a good idea? That's great, Olivia. It's how you word things. So one issue here is, did they front-end load the questions with a lot of context about, this is the Johnson & Johnson pause and the CDC did this. So, and are you aware of it? You would probably get a different answer if you said, what has the CDC done recently? Because it's a lot easier to say, are you aware that the CDC paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? And they say, oh yeah, sure. But if you're asking them to spontaneously uncover that, or what have you heard recently, you might get a quite different percentage. Those are good things. So talking about, let's think a little bit about taking this to a policy thing. It's like, is this a good idea toward the goal of getting people to become vaccinated? Even though, to lead this a little bit, even though we have a sample that represents all people in the US, maybe that's not the sample we should be talking about. Let me put it another way. If I am, let's see, that's right. That, to some extent, maybe we shouldn't even be looking at this because it seems like the pause is limited only to women and women of a certain age. So, in terms of, men probably should not really even care about it, or they, in their own self-interest, obviously they are members of families as well, relationships. And, what about if I was able to do a pre-post test rather than a single post test? Does that ring any bells? So maybe if I'm looking at the population of people who are favorable, that's right, that's it exactly, that we don't know what is the demography of hesitancy. We do not know whether the hesitancy of predominantly rural or predominantly male or predominantly Republican individuals are in response to this event. It could be that for this population of people, seeing this controversy about the vaccine only validates the thought that the vaccines have not been adequately tested. I'd also point out, given that some of the other things that I look at have to deal with epidemiology, that in the case of the Johnson & Johnson pause, it's important to know that the pause was done not only to caution people, caution women of a certain age about taking the vaccine, but also to get information out to the medical community that they paused this because healthcare providers need to know that there is this side effect and you don't treat it the way you would normally treat this side effect. As a matter of fact, if you treat it with heparin, which is a blood thinner, you're actually going to make this situation worse in this person and end up killing them more. So I mean, the policy implication is not only is this going to affect the choice of getting a vaccine, it's also to get information out to the healthcare community. So it was just kind of an interesting, oh yeah, there's some issues going on here. Was this can we view this as perhaps a double-barreled question? That, this was done, and was it, do you know it was done, and was it the right call? All right.